Look, it really is a privilege to be here. Thanks for the very kind words of introduction and the very warm welcome this evening. It's a particular privilege to do this with a fellow Trojan.
That's right. Fight on. Any Trojans in the house tonight? All right.
I say that as a Judge Whitney professor in the Trojan family, and this happens to be one of the events during my week at USC this semester. It's also a privilege to do this with someone who's racked up as many Emmy actual awards and Emmy nominations. Truly extraordinary, really. And so also an athlete. Yeah. And so now we're going to spar intellectually.
Okay.
Have at it.
And I know we have some USC ROTC in the house tonight, so thank you guys for being here as well, and thank you for your service. And we just wanted to say thank you to the World Affairs Council and to the Nixon Foundation for hosting us tonight. We both got an opportunity to tour the library here, and it is unbelievable. We were both completely blown away by the facilities here and a look at Richard Nixon's great legacy. And like many things in the Nixon White House, tonight's conversation is being recorded. So thanks to our folks in the back. It's on the Nixon Foundation Facebook Live page right now. So if you want to share that out with your friends so they know what you're doing here and let them know about the Nixon Foundation and hear about General Petraeus, you can do that right now. I think you can get on their free Wi-Fi network. And also some of my old colleagues from ABC7 are here as well. So this will be included in their newscast tonight at 11 o'clock. So let's get started. And let's begin with a sort of broad overview question, which is the idea of Trump's America First foreign policy. That's what he talked about so often during the campaign. That's what he talked about on the inauguration day. What is your assessment overall of what is happening so far?
Well, I think that if you had to choose between characterizing the emerging, because it's still early days in the administration, still the first 9 or 10 months, characterizing it as either more continuity or more change, interestingly, I think you would come down on the side of continuity. Now, there are some areas that I will specify where there is clearly change, and some others where there may be change, and some of those we can discuss. But if you look at, for example, the policy with China, the most important relationship in the world, of course, it dates all the way back to Nixon going to China, and only Nixon could have gone to China, by the way. I mean, a Democrat never could have pulled this off. It took someone who was sufficiently protected on his right flank to carry out such a bold move, and of course to be privileged to do it with such a great partner as Dr. Henry Kissinger. That established what is still the policy, the one China policy. Now, interestingly, during the campaign, candidate Trump was very critical of it. China was labeled a currency manipulator, an unfair trading partner, aggressive in the South and East China Sea, ineffective in dealing with its client state, North Korea, et cetera. After the election, President-elect Trump took a phone call from the Taiwanese president for the first time in 40 years, added insult to injury by tweeting about that afterwards. But ultimately, as the president, President Trump called President Xi. He pledged to continue the one China policy. He embraced it. He invited President Xi to Mar-a-Lago. They had the Mar-a-Lago summit, chartered 4 working groups, and indeed is just back from having visited Beijing to continue the tradition of presidents visiting there, of course, that begun again by the man for whom this library is named. So you have, again, an embrace of the one China policy. Certainly there are some issues about trade. Certainly there's pressure on China about North Korea, which we can talk about further. But essentially, that policy has been affirmed. Say the Israeli-Palestinian situation. You saw President Trump with President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu sitting next to him, said, one state, two state, whatever they want. The next day it was clarified the policy of the United States is the two-state solution. Didn't exactly embrace NATO early on, criticized its members for freeloaders, ultimately embraced the Article 5 collective self-defense element of that, the bedrock of that extraordinary alliance, and continues the policy. And if you work your way down one after the other, and I'd contend in the fight against the Islamic State and other Islamist extremists, has actually made some very prudent, good decisions, pushing decision-making authority down, adding some additional forces, certainly in Afghanistan, where the situation was very fraught, and also, again, allowing additional authorities for commanders, all of which I strongly supported. Again, it's generally continuity with some good tweaks. In some other cases, it's continuity with perhaps some others. Now, there are 3 areas where I do think we have to continue to watch to see if there will be true breaks with the past, and breaks, frankly, with the Nixonian tradition. I think of the United States leading the rules-based international order, and the quote that was given during the introduction. The first of these is with trade itself. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of course, the other candidate said she would do the same if elected. Probably would have found a way back to it. That's not something that I agreed with. I strongly supported TPP, more for geopolitical reasons than strictly for what it would do for our GDP. But again, that's a big step. We'll have to see what happens with the North American Free Trade Agreement negotiations and some of the other trade to determine if this is really a break or just one campaign promise that he actually had to implement. You see the same in climate, certainly an effort to deregulate in some of these areas, pledged to step out of the Paris Agreement in 2020. The truth is that's very symbolically important, but substantively will still meet the climate goals. I suspect it's largely its states, especially this one here, and its firms, and I think all of them realize it's both the smart thing to do as well as the right thing to do to do that. And then in immigration, really so far none of the big issues have been touched. What to do about the 12, 13 million, quote, illegal aliens on our soil who are tax-paying, law-abiding citizens, what to do about the dreamers, of course, that came with them, what to do about in terms of providing a legal pathway for unskilled workers, so important in the agriculture industry here, the hospitality industry, and then what to do about how to get more smart people, the H-1B visa, how to raise that limit. Those haven't been touched, so we really don't know. Beyond that, there is one that I do think is hugely important. And again, the message that the President Nixon was sending in that speech that was quoted was the importance of the United States continuing to lead the rules-based international order. This is the financial institutions, the multilateral organizations, and the norms and principles, all of which were established, largely brought into existence by the United States together with the other victors in the wake of World War II, and in the wake, frankly, of a 50-year period in which there were 2 ruinous world wars and the worst economic depression in human history. And those rules, those institutions, those organizations, for all of their shortcomings, and they have many, have stood the world in reasonably good stead, but they are now under more strain and stress than at any time since the end of the Cold War. I personally think it's hugely important that we continue to lead that rules-based system. I think the President does in some of his utterances, but then there is an ambivalence at other times about whether to continue to lead this. We've all had some of this. I mean, he's not the first president to come into office saying that we should do nation building at home, not abroad. But that is crucial now. Again, at no time in the last 30 or so years has there been so much in terms of this strain and stress put on the rules-based international order, and ironically a fair amount of that by the country that's benefited more from that particular system than any other. That's China, which enjoyed a 2-decade period in which year on year they grew over 10% in GDP virtually every single year. So that, I think, is one that's very worth watching. But again, interestingly, for all of the rhetoric, for all of the tweets, the occasional, what might be termed lack of message discipline, more continuity than change when you follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the substance.
And speaking of continuity, one thing that every administration for the last several decades has struggled with is North Korea. And today, the breaking news, I think the reason probably ABC's here, is the idea that we had another ballistic missile test, intercontinental ballistic test. Secretary Mattis said it was the highest test that they've had so far. Some experts telling agencies like CBS News that this could potentially reach the continental United States. A lot of people in this audience are probably scared when they hear that. What should the United States do in response to what happened today and what's been happening?
Well, first of all, this was a reckless move by the leader of the Hermit Kingdom, as North Korea is often termed, the most closed society in the world. And clearly, this is the time when China has to step forward. China controls 90% of the trade that goes to and from North Korea. China can literally turn out the lights in Pyongyang if they want to. They don't want to, and I think you can understand why. They want to bring Kim Jong-un to his senses, not to his knees. They don't want to cause the implosion of North Korea and see the reunification of Korea. That's a red line. They don't want a hostile power in Pyongyang, and they don't want millions of refugees entering China from North Korea across the Yalu River. This is the time for President Xi, who has consolidated power beyond that of any Chinese leader since Mao. In fact, since Mao, there largely was a degree of dispersion of power to prevent the kind of ruinous policy that Mao ultimately pursued, with, of course, which just set them back for a number of years. And so he now has status similar to that of Mao, with his thought being put into the Constitution in his own lifetime. The only other person to have that done is Mao. Deng had to die before that happened. And he is hugely empowered by this now. 5 more years, at least, as a result of the 19th Party Congress, has the ability, I think, to put much greater pressure on North Korea. Again, the Party Congress is done. He can focus on other issues now. And I think it's time to look to China to truly implement the sanctions that the UN Security Council has approved, to the United States to pursue additional financial sanctions. Among those, undoubtedly, will be further what are called secondary sanctions on banks, where Chinese banks are going to be given a choice. You can do business with the #1 economy of the world, or you can do business with North Korea, but you're not going to do business with both. Your choice. That's been done with one small bank to send a message so far. Now I think you get much more serious about that. But at the end of the day, diplomacy and sanctions still have, I think, a fair amount of effort that can be pursued. That has to be the focus at this time, even as there inevitably and responsibly has to be a variety of options examined by the military, noting that it is very, very difficult for a president to consider that, and noting that, in fact, it was, again, President Nixon, all the way back then, who first considered really kinetic activity in response to, I think it was a shoot down of a U.S. plane by North Korea. And even then, before North Korea had nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, chemical and biological weapons, and all the other capabilities they have now, even then the U.S. shrunk and did not actually take that action. Every president since then has considered strikes on North Korea, and inevitably has not given the go-ahead.
And I'm sure the Nixon Foundation people love all the shout-outs you're giving to President Nixon tonight. Well done.
Well, you know, we are here in the East Room of the White House, so.
Well, one of the big questions that a lot of people have is to try to figure out Kim Jong-un. Who is this guy? What's his psyche? What is he trying to get out of this? Do you? I know you don't want multiple questions, but
look, I mean, what an autocrat, what a dictator, especially someone who is so powerful, all-powerful, as Kim Jong-un is, wants, first of all, to survive, to keep his grip on power, having now consolidated it in some particularly gruesome and inventive ways of dispatching his half-brother, of course, with a nerve agent in a public airport, his mentor, his uncle, with an air defense artillery cannon, and a number of other ways that he's dispatched those who might have been at all rivals to him in the earlier years. That is not the case. He has fully consolidated power. And what he wants to do now is, of course, to continue to develop the capabilities that he's seen if they're given up by, say, Gaddafi, by Saddam, even by the Ukrainian government, have lost the deterrent that they might have had otherwise. He's in a very unenviable position in many respects. He's watched South Korea. Literally, South Koreans now are 4 to 5 inches taller than their North Korean ethnic brothers. Wow. The malnutrition is so severe. And many in this room have actually watched, I'm sure, over the decades as South Korea has developed in such an impressive manner, become one of the top 20 now, I think one of the top 15 economies in the world. In the meantime, the North just continues to stumble along, again, from famine to famine and shortage to shortage, albeit with some very clever, very creative uses of front companies, which is why we need to see embassies closed around the world. And to the consul generals who are here, if you still have a North Korean embassy on your soil, please close it post-haste. And then that will prevent them from the variety of different schemes they have, including some in cyberspace, where we saw the capability in the Sony hack, but there have been many other very clever uses of their capabilities in cyberspace, which is, again, quite extraordinary given that it's the most closed society and the least connected in the world.
And speaking of...
actually, if I could, one last point, because there's a huge analytical issue here. And it was there, it's all publicly known, back when I was the CIA director, still today. The assessment is that he is not suicidal, and that's a pretty big distinction. It's, again, a tough call because he has acted at times very impulsively, recklessly, but at the end of the day, his number one objective in life is to keep living, to survive, and I don't think that he would jeopardize that in the end. He is not, therefore, suicidal.
And you point out that Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons and ended up dead. So maybe he sees that as a model, too.
So did Saddam.
Yeah, so did Saddam. So let's talk about another perplexing world leader that a lot of people have questions about, and that's Vladimir Putin. How do you assess what he's trying to do right now?
Sure, it's really quite straightforward. You know, it's interesting. We just actually believe what people say from time to time, and he said in the previous century that the worst day of that century was the day in which the Soviet Union dissolved. In fact, he may have said the worst day in the history of mankind. He largely meant that. So what has he sought to do? He's sought to reassemble as much of the former Soviet Union or perhaps the Russian Empire, and he's done it through a variety of different mechanisms. There are security arrangements with the Central Asian states and some of the other countries in their periphery that used to be Russian republics. They have the Eurasia Economic Union. This is a very pale carbon copy of the European Union, but it has a few countries that are part of it. Of course, he's invaded some of his neighbors, Georgia. He's invaded Crimea and southeast Ukraine. He's kept troops on soil of Moldova, left over from the Cold War. They're still there, the Warsaw Pact days. He's intimidated and shut down with denial of service attacks, Estonia and other Baltic states, and had very reckless actions at sea and in the air. Most recently, an aviation incident over the Black Sea where a plane got in front of one of our reconnaissance aircraft and hit the turbine and caused all kinds of turbulence. So again, he is enjoying striding the world stage. He's enjoying the resurgence of the Russian military. He's using it in places like Syria, again, southeastern Ukraine and elsewhere. It's also, of course, the greatest gift to NATO. Again, NATO has a reason to live again. President Trump may well claim some credit for pushing the NATO countries to spend more on defense, and they have. Arguably, it's a bit more President Putin and concerns about the vulnerability of East European NATO members. But at the end of the day, this is all about an individual who sees himself as the leader of a great country, who had to be hugely vexed when President Obama labeled Russia a regional power. And, you know, I think he's been trying to show ever since then that Russia is more than a regional power, and it is. although it has its limits. And he is experiencing those with the much reduced price of oil and the much reduced price of natural gas.
Let's move, as we continue to move around the world, there's so much we could go on to everything, but while talking to you, how do we not talk about the Middle East and the Arab states? And one of the things that's really interesting that's going on right now that's not getting probably enough media attention is what's happening in Saudi Arabia. A real change. A young man there is coming to power and making dramatic changes to Saudi Arabia. Talk to people here about what's happening there and your perspective on if it's a good thing.
Well, somebody asked me the other day, so, General, tell us about what you see in the transition in Saudi Arabia. And I said, this is not a transition. This is a revolution ongoing. In fact, it's 4 revolutions. The first is a revolution in governance. This is a country where there used to be, one set of the family's brothers or sons would be Ministry of Defense, another controlled the National Guard, which was an active duty force, another might control the Ministry of Interior. There is a degree of distribution of power. Certainly one would ultimately be elevated to Crown Prince and then the key, but they sort of took turns doing that. And the best of each of these different groups would be elevated. He now controls. He started with the Ministry of Defense, which he inherited when his father became the king. He was then made Deputy Crown Prince. He dispatched the Crown Prince, who was also the Minister of Interior, put his man in there. And most recently, of course, the National Guard commander was allowed to retire a bit early, and also, I think, had residence in the Ritz there for a while, where they were the nicest jail cells in all of the world, where they were negotiating with individuals who had allegedly gathered a good bit more than they might have gotten out of their government salaries. So you have, again, a revolution in governance. That's a big deal. He's consolidated power. And he is the Crown Prince and doing it all in the name of his father, the king. The second revolution is the economic revolution. It's his keen awareness that they have to reform the economy, that they have to diversify. They can't depend on the sale of oil, especially if it's going to stay down in the $50 or $60 range. They just cannot survive on that. In fact, you can do the math. Saudi Arabia's got less than $500 billion left in its sovereign wealth funds. It probably needs to keep about 200 of that as a buffer for the banking system, the currency, or what have you. So you've got about 300 billion. You might get 100 billion out of an IPO for a piece of Aramco. You might get tens of billions out of these extraordinarily wealthy multi-billionaires who are going to give back some of what they got, perhaps not through normal means. But you can do the math. If you're running a deficit each year of $50 to $70 billion a year, you've got less than 10 years. So he knows that he has to transform the economy of Saudi Arabia from a largely dependent on petrodollars from export of oil to much more diversification, and they've got to generate a lot more income from all the rest of this. That's, I think, what has driven him to conclude that he had to take the reins of power, that he has to drive this personally. I've met with him on a number of different occasions. The very first time, in fact, when I hosted his father at the CIA for lunch. By the way, just as an aside, it was the only time anybody has smoked inside the CIA headquarters in about 5 or 10 years, but I realized, being the clever intelligence officer that I was, I knew that he was a very heavy smoker. And for some reason, the guys didn't allow him to have his smoke break between what he had before eating lunch with me and the lunch. And he was literally fidgeting. I could see him looking around, and is there a place, you know, where he could open a window or something? And so I had my executive assistant get the message, turn off all the sprinkler systems and the smoke alarms. And, you know, and then I said, you know, Your Highness, you know, as a special exemption, if you'd like to smoke, I'd be happy to allow you that privilege. And, you know, it was a wonderful gesture.
Cigarette diplomacy.
Gratefully taken, yes. And it's the only person I've ever seen didn't smoke between courses. He actually smoked between bites. Oh. But he's well into old age. He's the king. And again, very much supportive of his son, the Crown Prince, labeled by some as the young man in a hurry. And he's in a great hurry. The third and fourth revolutions are also significant. There's a revolution in terms of society and religion that could be profound, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for the entire Muslim world. He wants to moderate the practice of Islam in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is extraordinary. And again, this is a kingdom that has supported an ultra-conservative Wahhabi form of Islam in many other countries where it has caused some challenges for those countries. I've served in some of these. We've seen this in some of our European allies' situations. And so that is very significant. He wants to allow women to drive, to have movie theaters, to have music, to have theme parks, all of this. And this is, again, extraordinarily revolutionary for a country where change takes a very long time normally. And then finally, there's a revolution in foreign policy as well. It used to be said, I was not one of those who said it, but the critics of the kingdom used to say that they were ready to fight to the last American, that they would hold our coat while we went into the ring and fought for them. And they decided that is not going to be what they're going to do. And he got together with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, another extraordinarily influential and impressive individual and visionary leader, and they decided that they were not going to accept what happened in Yemen, where the Shia Houthis, who couldn't get the results at the ballot box they wanted, couldn't get them at the negotiating tables, pulled out their AK-47s and got it at the point of a weapon. A lot of issues. The Saudis would be the first to say that they needed to improve the accuracy of their bombing and a variety of the other operational tactics, techniques, and procedures, but they have gone ahead and done that. And then there are other areas where there's been a degree of greater intervention outside in there, near abroad, if you will. So all of these are very profound, and frankly, I think we should hope that they succeed, because for Saudi Arabia, which is the cornerstone and the keystone both of the Arab world, certainly of the Sunni Arab world, it is crucial that they do well and that they don't falter in this particular endeavor.
Isn't it extraordinary to think that a revolutionary idea is that women can drive? You know, how
you know,
different.
it is, and
Yeah.
he said, I can't believe this. He said in the Quran, a woman can drive a camel in the Quran, but she can't drive a car in Saudi Arabia today.
Yeah. And they gave citizenship to an artificial intelligence woman too, and that's a whole other story. All right, we're gonna. So we're talking about the potential modernization of Islam in Saudi Arabia, while at the same time
Moderation.
While at the same time, the Islamic State wants to go potentially the other way. We've seen the caliphate itself start to shrink, but we've seen a lot of the homegrown terror start to increase, especially in parts of Europe. Where do you see things right now in terms of the fight against ISIS?
Let me give 5 lessons I think we should have learned from the past 16 years of war against Islamist extremists. And then from that, you'll see how this all falls out. The first of these is that ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world will be exploited by Islamist extremists. Not a question of if, it's a question of when and how significant. The second is we have to do something about it. Las Vegas rules do not apply in these places. What happens there does not stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries and the region, but all the way into the countries of our NATO allies in Western Europe, causing the biggest domestic political challenges they've had since the end of the Cold War. So you have to do something. You can't do what Washington tries to do at times, which is admire a problem until it goes away. This problem is not going away. The third is that in doing something, generally, the U.S. has to lead. Perhaps in a small situation, France might take Mali. We'll still end up there in a substantial way, as we've learned now in the tragic developments in Niger. But generally, the U.S. is going to have to lead, and it's because the U.S. has more of the assets that are proving so extraordinarily useful. I'm talking in particular about the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms that we have, Predators and Reapers in particular, because of the 150 people that are behind each one of those that allow you to keep well over 60 orbits, eyes in the sky, full-time, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. These are incredibly useful. We also shoot from our platforms as needed, and then in addition we have a large number of precision strike weapon systems and the industrial strength ability to fuse intelligence. We do want to do this with a coalition. I say that despite having commanded the largest coalition in an actual war fight, and that was in Afghanistan. Knowing the challenges of a coalition, you know, as Winston Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. We should have allies. We especially want Muslim countries to be in that coalition. And by the way, I salute again the consul generals who are here tonight, many of whom are from the Mideast, and I hope will generally affirm what it is that I'm offering. The fourth lesson is that you have to understand the paradox that you cannot counter extremists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda with terrorist groups like that with just counter-terrorist operations. In other words, you can't drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. You have to have a comprehensive approach. It has to be all of the elements of the strategy that we pursued in this comprehensive civil-military counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq during the surge, but, and this is a huge but not with us doing all of the fighting on the front lines, not with us having to do all the political reconciliation, the reconstruction, the restoration of basic services, the politics, the rule of law reestablishment, et cetera, but helping host nations do that, and we've gotten a great deal of experience in how to do that, and been able to prove that capability in the cases of Iraq and with some of our partners in Syria as well. And that's hugely important because the fifth takeaway, if you will, the fifth lesson of these past 16 years is that we're engaged in a generational struggle. This is not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. This is going to go on for many decades. We will have successes as we have had, as our partners have had on the ground with our support, our advice, our assistance, and our enabling capabilities, taking away the caliphate, as you noted, on the ground, largely in Iraq, largely in Syria, although there's still a big piece for the Al-Qaeda affiliate that we have to help our Syrian partners there. But there will be others elsewhere, and you have to go after them everywhere. You can't play whack-a-mole. You have to whack all the moles all the time, everywhere. And we can actually do that. But to do that, we have to recognize, given the duration of this, you have to have a sustained commitment. That means it has to be sustainable, and that is measured in blood and in treasure. And I think we have figured out now how to do that. I think we have demonstrated that in Iraq and in Syria. I'm hopeful that we can demonstrate it in Afghanistan with the additional forces and authorities that have been provided to the commander there. A superb 4-star, was a 2-star under me when I was privileged to command there. And we will have to continue the efforts in a whole variety of other places, ideally, always ideally, working through host nation partners, such as those that we have now in Syria and the opposition leaders. One of them is here, of course.
Well, let's talk about Syria a little bit more. The position of the United States government under the Obama administration was regime change, or at least that's what they publicly said was the position. Well, that was the stated U.S. policy, right, that Bashar al-Assad must go, but we did not take, obviously didn't take sufficient action, if action at all, right, to really make him go. Do you think that Bashar al-Assad is there to stay for at least a long time to come? I mean, is there any chance that there actually will be regime change?
Look, Bashar al-Assad is responsible for the deaths of over 500,000 of his own country's citizens. He's responsible for the displacement of over 1/2 of his country's population, 1/2 of that external to the country. Extraordinary hardship. Has obliterated areas of the country where his forces could not regain control. So they basically, it's the so-called destroying Aleppo to save it kind of approach. But at the end of the day, because of support from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, Iran proper and the funding streams, Lebanese Hezbollah, a Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force enabled militia and political force in Lebanon, and then ultimately Russian air power and Russian special operations, I think that he is probably going to continue to lead that part of the country over which he has control. My hope has been, in fact, for years I've advocated at least that we should establish safe havens enclaves, no-fly zones, and repeatedly we were told this was too hard. Well, this is exactly what we've done. And by the way, we even shot down a Syrian aircraft when it threatened one of those enclaves. And I hope that we will stay with those forces who have fought and bled and sacrificed a great deal as they try to rebuild their communities, as humanitarian assistance can be provided, refugees can return, and the rest of Syria can see what life could be like, indeed, if they could rid themselves of this barbarous leader who has brought such ruin on his country.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that are listening to this right now that are thinking, man, this guy's smart, right? And like, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great to have him in government again? And I know you were considered a finalist for Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. What was that experience like?
Well, this is my, celebrity apprentice moment, actually. Well, it was interesting. I certainly I had not done anything with the campaign. I'm truly non-political. I actually literally stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars. We haven't registered for years. We have not voted. I'm not advocating this for others at all. In fact, I think everybody should vote. I mean, it's one of the rights that many of us fought to protect. But at the end of the day, the call came, and I think if a president-elect asks to consult with you, that you should indeed do that. And so I went over to Trump Tower and sat down with him. It was interesting because I realized that he had a list in front of him, and he was trying to determine, can this guy help me, President-elect Trump, turn campaign promises and pledges into policies? And we'd go down the list, and he'd say, should we build a wall? I'd say, sure, we should build a wall where we don't already have a wall, where a wall would do good, and as part of a comprehensive approach to improving security on our southern border that would also include more border operations officers, more taxes they're called, more surveillance, more technology, more cooperation with Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. But I had a list as well. And so I had to convince myself that, again, his views were not such at variance with mine that, you probably should agree to go separate ways. I asked him, for example, let me get this right, President-elect, you're not against trade, you're just against unfair trade, right? He said, yeah. I said, I can deal with it. You don't need, just give me the big ideas, and we could develop a policy around those. So it was an interesting process. He seemed to think it went well. I mean, there was an approving tweet afterwards. I mean, there's no higher praise than that. But I can also understand why the prospect of being able to hire the guy that ran the largest organization in the entire world might be appealing to him as well.
What do you think, although you weren't chosen for the administration, he does have many other generals in the administration, people that you know very well, General Mattis, General McMaster, General Kelly. What do you think is the value of having 4-star generals around him? And do you think that's making an
Well,
impact?
it's not just 4-star generals. I think it's 4-star generals with the experiences that these individuals bring. Look, no one knows better than they do because we all learned it together in some very tough, unyielding battlefields, that the solution to every problem is not a nail and the solution is not a bigger hammer. Again, the big idea, as I just expressed to you, is that you have to have comprehensive approaches. It has to be a civil-military campaign. Again, by the way, Nixon very much got this. He and Kissinger had the most intricate, nuanced, and articulate, intricate concepts for all of this. And so they know that. And, the idea that they are going to be quick to go to war or something that really runs counter to all of the analyses. And by the way, for what it's worth, my dissertation when I was in graduate school was on military, the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. And one of those was, really this is the last resort if you're going to do it, all these different, make sure you got the objectives and the forces and everything else. Sadly, we also, though, in our zeal to never do another Vietnam, the no more Vietnams, we also threw out anything we might have learned about counterinsurgency, and even did away with some of the capabilities to actually carry out that kind of campaign, which is one reason we had to do a lot of the intellectual architecture in the early years of Iraq, and a lot of this culminated in the production of the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps field manual on counterinsurgency that we published in the shortest period of time of any field manual in history in 2006. By the way, my Marine counterpart for that was none other than Jim Mattis, and unfortunately didn't get to sign it because he left his job a week before the publication date. But look, I know Mattis very, very well. We were fellow division commanders in the fight to Baghdad. We did a subsequent tour together when I came back as a 3-star. He supported the surge from down the road at Camp Pendleton. He replaced me at Central Command. We've even been friends since then. I mean, we brought him to USC, where he learned what an extraordinary privilege it is to be associated with the Trojan family, as you well know.
Greatest privilege.
I say that with all due respect to the Bruins in the audience and some other schools that might be there. You know, they say at USC, thank God for UCLA, everybody can't get into SC.
Yeah. Yeah. They're spending a lot of money on a new, on their old football coach and their new football coach. Okay, we can do a whole thing on that. Before we get to audience questions,
what was the score of that game again?
Yeah, exactly. I want to ask one
Don't ask about last year.
Overriding question, because most people here aren't going to be in the cabinet, and most people here aren't going to be 4-star generals. But what you have learned about leadership in those roles is pretty extraordinary, and I think can be applied to a broad variety of fields, to young people, to older people in positions of leadership. Sort of, what are the most important lessons or takeaways that we can learn from your experience that can be applied to everyday life?
Well, let me start with, I've got a whole
I'm sure
pitch
you write a
on
book about
strategic
that.
leadership. Well, you can actually go to the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and there's a whole strategic leadership website that I established. I'm also a fellow up there. And then I'll talk a bit about what might be termed, you know, what's a leadership style. But a strategic leader, but this is true of really any leader within the confines of one's organization and so forth. A strategic leader has to get 4 tasks right. You've got to get the big ideas right. This is not that simple, by the way. They don't hit you on the head like Newton's apple, fully formed, if you sit under the right tree. Normally, it's iterative, it's inclusive, you have to play with it. It's like bringing a clay object into being. You have to communicate the big ideas through the breadth and depth of the organization. You have to oversee their implementation in many subtasks. In each of these, this includes how do you spend your time, what's your battle rhythm, what do you do every day, once a week, every other week, monthly, quarterly, et cetera, et cetera. We had a huge matrix that laid out what I did during the surge and each of my other 4-star positions and at the CIA. And then, often overlooked, you have to have a formal process to identify what the changes are needed to the big ideas so that you can do it all again and again and again. By the way, Netflix, so this is very true in the business world as well, and I have enormous respect for Reed Hastings and have talked about this with him. If you think about them, they've done this 3 or 4 times now. They started out saying big idea number 1 is let's put Blockbuster out of business by mailing CDs instead of having brick and mortar. They communicate it through the organization, pretty small at that time. They oversee the implementation. They get down here and say, hey man, that's fantastic, Blockbuster's out of business. But now a bunch of other firms are also mailing CDs out, so what do? They said, well, broadband speeds are fast enough now, why don't we have them download CDs, movies, whatever else it is that we're going to sell, to rent. So they do all the different steps, and they get down here and say, fantastic, that's really going well. What do we do now? Others are now starting to do that. Well, let's bet $100 million in House of Cards original content provision. Do that all the way through, and then, then the most recent one is they've been trying to do blockbusters, doing pretty successfully, although the one that was about Stan McChrystal, I thought was the most wooden soldier that I've ever seen on camera. And it was sad that it was Brad Pitt, because I was hoping he was going to hold out and play me. Well, but
he's got lots of range. He can do lots.
I had the guy from Gladiator playing me in my brief cameo during that particular movie. But so again, these tasks are very relevant wherever you are. It's relevant in your own life, frankly, your personal life. And then beyond that, I used to get a lot of questions about, so General, tell me how would you describe your leadership style? And I think they thought I'd say, well, I'm firm but fair, or, I'm laissez-faire, or I'm a micromanager, I don't, whatever it may be, some broad characterization. And I would always answer by saying, if you'll tell me the leadership style that is required to create conditions that get the best out of each of my direct reports individually and for the organization collectively, then I'll tell you the type of leadership style that I am going to try to practice. And I think that's a crucial point for young people in particular who think that you have one style, it's always the same. And thank you for the Air Force Lieutenant Colonel ROTC program, I assume, at USC, I hope. Terrific, okay. Yeah. Who is nodding over there sagely and agreeing. But truly, I think understanding that big idea about leadership style is crucial to being an effective leader. Because again, what succeeded when I was a romping, stomping airborne ranger platoon leader, second lieutenant, would have gotten you thrown off over the desk at the CIA or some other organization. You have to have a very different style. But even within the CIA, the approach to the analysts was a bit different than the approach to the so-called operators, or the techies, or the support people.
That reminds me of a time when I was at USC. One of the great moments of my life, I had an opportunity to talk to John Wooden, the great UCLA coach who was on campus, and then Pete Carroll, who was the coach at the time, came and sat with us at a table. And John Wooden liked to say that some guys need a pat on the back and some guys need a pat a little bit lower.
Yeah,
that was one of his saying. Everybody has their own approach.
Yeah, no, I mean, some people need a pat on the back once a year. I might need it once a week. Others might need, as you say, a pat a bit lower every hour.
All right, well, let's get to, I'm hogging this conversation, so let's get, I think Dr. Mark Johnson from Claremont, or from Chapman University, is here, from the Department of Political Science. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your contributions to this organization.
I'm here from Claremont, I'm here from Chapman, I'm here from the World Affairs Council, I'm here from the Hoover Institution, I'm here from wherever you want me to be.
Excellent.
But most of all, for me, this is particularly interesting because decades ago, for those of you that are veterans, I was an E5 sergeant. So for me, to be talking to a 4-star is a little intimidating under the best of circumstances. I've been given the opportunity to ask you some questions from our audience this evening. I've synthesized them down to the ones you haven't already asked. So the first 30 are on North Korea. Thank you. You took care of that. So I've tried to come up with the ones that might be relevant, that we have a short length of time. How do we ensure that Russia and Iran do not dictate the future of Syria and Iraq? And I would add, if that's not already been done.
Well, in large measure, they have largely bounded the potential for Syria. They, first of all, saved Bashar al-Assad when he was teetering in his post on several occasions, bailed him out, and helped him prevail to the extent that he has, recapturing a number of areas that the opposition had taken control of. And they are certainly, to a degree, circumscribing, I think, the possibilities for the future of Syria. But how do we then play a role? 99, 95, 90% of success is just showing up. We need to show up, and we need to be present, as we are, and as we have been much more present in the past 9 months or so than we were before. So I think that's the future. By the way, let me actually do something that I'd meant to do earlier. Those of us in my generation get the thanks of a grateful nation routinely wherever we are. We have done right by those who have served, particularly since the 9/11 attacks. We've thanked them at the airport. We've thanked them with support for a variety of veterans organizations, by recognition, and so on. But that was not the case for those who served our country during Vietnam. They were spat upon when they returned. They raised their right hand, took the oath, having been drafted. They were not volunteers. Every one of us in the post 9/11 period certainly was a volunteer. They were drafted, they went off and fought a tough, brutal war in the jungles, on the ground, very heavy casualties. And as I said, when they came home, they were reviled by the country for which they were fighting. And so if I could ask those who served in the Vietnam era to please stand so that we can thank you and do it right this time. Thank you very much.
And just to add to that as well, on behalf of this crowd, thank you for decades of service to this country as well. Thank you for your service.
It was an honor and a privilege to serve in that era.
In any era.
And I was one of the crazy ones that actually enlisted. Another topic that did not come up tonight that many of us, I think, would agree is pivotal. Where does Turkey, NATO, and their position in the modern Middle East really fit? What do you anticipate or expect there?
Well, as somebody who first set foot on Turkish soil over 40 years ago now, again, as that young airborne second lieutenant on a number of different occasions, and having watched Turkey evolved, in some ways very impressively, the economic development, the political evolution for quite a sustained period, a staunch NATO ally, hugely important, of course, in the southeastern flanks of NATO. But it has been concerning to see developments in recent years. There has been a growing level of autocratic government. There has been a creeping Islamization that is contrary to the secular approach of the founder of the modern-day Turkey, Kemal Ataturk. And there has been a willingness to, say, work with Russia as a NATO ally that has been of some concern as well. So there are some tough issues without question, but at the end of the day, Turkey has been and remains a very important NATO ally in a crucial part of the world, in many respects a bridge between East and West, between the world of Islam and the world of Christianity in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And so again, this is a country that we want to stand by, that we want to continue to stand with, to frankly use their air base at Incirlik and a variety of other facilities, and to hope that we can work through the friction that characterizes the relationship right now, and over the years ahead, that we can resume the kind of close allied relationship that we've enjoyed in the past.
Thank you. Although I realize that Jim Mattis, who is a dear friend, indicated that his job is to keep people awake at night. The question I would have for you that's more traditional from some of our audience, what is the issue that, if any, that keeps you awake at night?
Well, you know, when I was the director of the CIA, I used to say, you know, what night? Because there certainly are a variety, again, as I think I characterized earlier, not only is there more strain and stress in the rules-based international order than we've had at any time since the end of the Cold War, there's really a degree of complexity and sheer quantity of challenges right now that I think is unique in the post-Cold War era as well. You don't just have revisionist powers that aren't satisfied with the status quo like Russia, Iran, North Korea, and to a degree China, which is also our #1 trading partner and the country with whom we have the most important relationship in the world. There's not just the Islamist extremists that we've talked about, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and various affiliates around the world. There are domestic populist pressures that are causing significant challenges for allies in Europe and elsewhere. And then there's the one that we haven't actually talked about that might be one that really keeps you awake at night, and that's the growing number of cyber threats. It's not just nation states which we think we can deter. You know, they might be able to shut down our electrical grid, but we know that we can shut theirs down, so they probably won't do it, and they have a return address, and we'll figure out what it is over time. Various other activities, whether it's theft of intellectual property or trying to undermine our confidence in our democratic system, perhaps put a finger on the scales in an election and that kind of thing. It's not just the ever more diabolically creative criminals in cyberspace, exploiting opportunities there, obviously, for financial gain. The one that worries me is Islamist extremists who will blow themselves up on the battlefield to take us with them. And I don't know what deters them from hitting the send key if they ever get the cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction. This would be defined as, say, the ability to shut down the electrical grid for the northeastern part of the United States and keep it down. And so you'd have, over time, the kind of situation that we've had in some very severe floods, particularly Hurricane Katrina, where after a while, as the lights stay out, even the emergency systems start to fail because you just can't resupply them with fuel fast enough. You can't, and nothing is working. And so the amount of problems that would produce, again, would be horrendous, particularly if it's in a certain time of the year, either an extremely cold period or even an extremely hot time. And that is one that I think bears some very, very careful consideration and can be a source of real worry, because the industrial control systems, the so-called SCADA systems of the electrical grid and other infrastructure that really matters, water systems and so forth, these are not the most modern of technology, and there's a lot of vulnerabilities there that we've really got to address.
It's ironic that you would mention that. I had the opportunity over the past couple of years to spend a little bit of time with both of your colleagues, Mike Morrell and General Hayden, and their answer was almost verbatim, exactly as the same as yours. It's clearly.
Well, Michael was my deputy after all.
Right, exactly.
And I had a chance to talk to
you taught him well.
Yeah, to talk to Jay Johnson when he was Homeland
Right.
Security Secretary, and he said the exact same thing too. Cyber
Because
was
I am, in theory, at the moment representing the World Affairs Council questions, and we're here under the kind auspices also of the Nixon Foundation. I'm going to take a moment and let Jerry Harrington, one of their major supporters and the World Affairs Council supporter, ask a question as well. Jerry.
General, do you think there is any real hope of ever defeating the Taliban?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to.
I don't think you ever have a situation where you take the hill, plant the flag, and go home to a victory parade. I think, again, you're going to have a comprehensive campaign. It's a test of wills. The Taliban famously have said, you may have the watches, but we have the time. It's the graveyard of empires and all of the rest of this. Having stated all that, though, I don't think that you cannot continue to achieve our objectives in Afghanistan. By the way, it's really important to remember why we went there and why we have stayed. It's always good to come back to the mission, to the big idea. The reason we went to Afghanistan is quite simple. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned, in a sanctuary that was enjoyed by al-Qaeda under Taliban rule in most of Afghanistan at that time. That's where the initial training of the attackers was undertaken. We went in there to destroy that sanctuary and to ensure that it was not reestablished. We have done that. We did do that in the wake of 9/11, and we have sustained that. But let me tell you, they want to come back to that area of Afghanistan, and so now does the Islamic State. And so I think it's incumbent on us to continue a reasonable level of support for our Afghan partners, and we have an Afghan president right now who is supporting efforts for the first time in some respects to go after the Taliban's illegal narcotics operations, which fuel an awful lot of that insurgency, give them a lot of the capability that they have in various places of the country. Ashraf Ghani is a terrific political leader in Afghanistan, highly intelligent, and he is supportive of the campaign that we're pursuing and engaged in it, and the commander-in-chief of his Afghan forces in ways that his predecessor was not. We had challenges in those days, indeed. There were a couple of times where I actually had, in fact, I would go to him to go to the then president of Afghanistan and say that if he did not, quote, clarify the position that he had just given to the Washington Post, that he was going to be carrying on the war in Afghanistan without me, because I'd be on the next plane to Washington and I intended to take the policy with me. That's a fairly big deal when you do that. It's sort of the all-in moment, and we had a couple of those at that time. So I'm very supportive of the president's policy to add 3,500, 4,000 additional advisors, forces that can provide enabling capabilities, trainers and so forth, and also authorities to use the assets that we have there more effectively than we have in the past.
Thank you so much for your insight, your illumination, and your wisdom. And I will now turn it over to the actual chairs of this whole thing.
Can I just say one final word, if I could? Those in this room who have served in uniform, particularly those who have served downrange in combat, know that nothing means more, really. Beyond the trust and confidence of those on your left and right than the knowledge that those back home appreciate what you're doing, support you and your family members, even if they don't agree with the policy that you might be helping to implement. And I've never seen that more dramatically than on the 4th of July, 2008, it was the second year of the surge. I was conducting what turned out to be the largest re-enlistment ceremony in our history as far as we can find out. It was 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, a sea of uniforms in front of me in a former Saddam palace. I was the re-enlistment officer, and they were reciting the oath after me, and I just kept asking myself, what is this all about? You know, the economy at that time was still booming, plenty of opportunity. By raising their right hand and reciting the oath again to re-enlist, they knew they're going to be asked to go back to war probably at least one more time. You know, there weren't any big stock options associated with that action, to put it mildly. And all I could figure out was that, you know, there were three big motivations here. One is they felt privileged to serve our country in a mission that's larger than self. Second, they felt privileged to do it with others who felt the same way. And third, they felt that those back home supported them and appreciated what it was that they were doing. Nothing means more. Now, there are few parts of this country, if any, that have been more supportive of our men and women in uniform than this area of Southern California. And so I want to end tonight by saying, on behalf of all those with whom I was privileged to serve, in fact, for whom I was privileged to be their commander, to thank you so much for your great support of our men and women in uniform and their families. Thank you very much.
Thank you.